All right, we're on. Let's see what we have here. 11 looks like. All right. So we are, welcome everybody online and here in class. We're here to finish up part 2, Judaism. Judaism this week, next week, we finished up Judaism this week. Next week, of course, is Christianity. That will take some time because it's we need to, it's a pretty good chapter in and of itself, but also we want to do a little history of Christianity down the ages, and that takes some time. In fact, we've done classes before where it's just the history of Christianity and spend a semester on that. And so we'll spend some time on that and look at, as far as Christianity, 100 years ago, a little more, 100 years ago, you had probably 30 or 40 distinct denominations. Now there are, they're just uncountable. They're just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And because they keep breaking off and breaking off and breaking off, the chaos in that is pretty amazing. But everybody has different ideas on what it is, and so it's easy to break off and start your own denomination. So, but we won't spend time with all of those. We'll just look at some of the main ones that are there and some of the history that we have. But that's next week. So I think we finished right up in this. Those of you who have a book, we finished right. There we're talking about religious values. I think we'll just repeat those very quickly. There, just as kind of as a review, and the idea is that there are 5 main themes in Judaism. Of course, it's God, the prophets, law, justice, and the Messiah, obviously. And then they had Maimonides, one of the great scholars in Judaism, laid down 13 principles, and these what he called the 13 articles of faith. Number 1 is God is the creator of the universe. Number 2, God is one, and he alone is our God. Number 3, God has no body, form, or likeness. 4, God is eternal. 5, one must worship and pray only to God. 6, the words of the prophets are true. 7, Moses is the greatest of the prophets. 8, the Torah or law was given by God to Moses. 9, the Torah is eternal and will not be changed. 10, God knows all the thoughts and all the deeds of people. 11, God rewards those who keep his laws and punishes those who disobey them. 12, God will send his Messiah, the anointed one, to usher in a new and better world. And 13, God will revive the dead. And that last one is interesting because when I first really talked with someone, there was a Jewish woman who was trying to talk me into insurance, I think even before I was married. So that was a long time ago. And we had dinner or lunch one day when she was talking to me insurance, but we got around to talking about religion because she mentioned she was Jewish and mentioned that her father had left Judaism, so to speak, because of the Holocaust, and couldn't understand why God would allow such a thing to happen. It was my first time speaking with somebody of the Jewish faith, and I don't remember all that we talked about because it was over 40 years ago, but it was quite interesting, and of course always fascinated with these things, and so we had quite a long conversation, but and of course spent a lot of time, 10 years or more later, spent a lot of time with a rabbi learning things for 3 years or so. So working on my master's course and needed a language. And so I wanted to learn Hebrew so I could read the Old Testament in the original. And fortunately I had a rabbi that was very patient with me. Used to go visit him once a week, and rabbis are interesting people because he's just not going to teach me the language. It's going to be all the different principles and so on. We had just a wonderful time, and
his name start with an S.
Yeah, it was
because we went to services there.
Yeah, we did. We took them out there. Selnick, Rabbi Selnick, and I used to take classes there. When we did Old Testament, we'd go on a Friday evening and spend time and go to the services with them, and then they'd take us into a small chapel, and we'd go over these different things, and talk about, people had questions, and then they'd have not coffee for us, but hot chocolate and cookies or something in the um, not kitchen area, but in the what would you call it? I don't know. Anyway, whatever it was, but yeah, it was quite interesting, and maybe an interesting story that might be interesting to some of you. I mentioned I was studying this, and this is just so like universities and the way they run things. Studying Hebrew, and you have to take a test to pass to get that credit for that language, and you have to have a language when you're working on these things and masters. And so I picked Hebrew, as I said, and you take a test. You have 3 opportunities to take it and pass it, and the advisor over my program said, just go ahead and take it. Study it, take it, just study it so you know what it's like. You have an hour. You can take you have 800 words or so. Or maybe it's more than that, but anyway, it was a lot, it seemed like at the time. And you have an hour. You can take a dictionary. It won't help you because you don't have the time to look things up. So I took it the first time and did like 250 words, and my advisor said, that's good. That's good for for just a first attempt. And so then I waited, I don't know, a few months, and then took it again, and did a little over 400 words. And my readers were the one who was a Jewish professor in the arts and science, and the other one was a Israeli engineer in the engineering department. And so they were my readers. And when I did a little over 400 words, they both failed me again. And I talked to my advisor, and he said, they failed you? He says, we pass people all the time who do 400 words plus, even not even 400 words. Something's going on there. Something's not right. You need to check this out. So I went and talked to the assistant dean, and she says, well, don't you know what's going on? And I said, no, I guess it was well known in the departments, at least in the higher ups. And she said, well, your 2 readers hate the rabbi. They hate him because he comes at times to the university and teaches, and he doesn't have a doctorate. And I said, he's a doggone rabbi. I mean, they start learning when they're 3 years old, right? He knows more than he's being, no question. She goes, I said, this isn't right. She says, well, I don't know what to tell you. They're your readers. She says, why don't you take Spanish or something? I said, I'm doing ancient history. They didn't have Spanish back then. I want to. She says, I don't know what to tell you. It's the way it is. So I went and talked to the advisor, and he says, well, I guess you just have to really pass it this time. So I took a couple of days off and studied. And we only did narrative. We did Genesis, Exodus, maybe. None of the prophets, because they're too hard, especially Isaiah. But I studied and then went back in, and when the hour ran out this time, I was on the last sentence, and so they would have no choice. But I got my paper back, and my test back, and the one from arts and science says pretty good, pass. The Israeli said, well, not that good, but pass. And so, yeah, thank you. So anyway, I went to the rabbi and mentioned to him, and he was just quite excited. He said, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. He says, go home and have some wine on me. And then he goes, oh, never mind. He knew I was LDS. He said, I'll drink the wine. You just, relax. And I said, all right, thank you very much. I'll do that. He was a great man. He was just a wonderful, wonderful man. He's long gone now, but he lost a good portion of his family in the Holocaust. And so it was, but he was very patient, and it was wonderful to work with him. Yeah, never forget him. But anyway, so going on, who is God? Who do the Jews think of as God? As we mentioned, I think we may have just covered this briefly, but the ancient Jews ancient Israelites believed in a living anthropomorphic God, one who was, you could touch, feel, whatever. And like many of these gods, and things would change as time went on, mostly because of the Hellenistic influence, the Greek Hellenistic, of course, in reference to Greek, the idea of Hellenistic, especially after the time of Alexander the Great, who spread Hellenism throughout that part of the world. And so they adopted and were brought in, as Christianity would later, a lot of the Greek philosophical thought and into scripture and other things. And so they and of course the Greeks never once they had dumped the pantheon, the Greek pantheon, as you know, the Zeus and all of those, they dumped that. They looked at it as, you know, the God was omnipresent, but he was without body or form of any sort. And you see that in the first, you see the influence of that in the first sentence of Genesis. You know, Bereshit bara Elohim et Shemayim v'aretz. Bara, that word there, in the beginning, you know, we usually hear in the beginning God created, but it was always, the Jews never believed that God could create something out of nothing. It's illogical, it's not rational, and the Jews knew this, but the idea was that the bara means to form with, you know, what's already there. So when God created, so to speak, he actually formed, as far as the Jews were concerned, he formed the heavens and the earth from that which was already there. Greek thought changes that to the idea that God created out of nothing the heavens and the earth, but that was not the original thought of the ancient Israelites. And so, and we would, of course, agree with that. That was Joseph Smith that said, no, this idea of creating out of nothing is ridiculous. You know, well, first off, it's not logical. When you just say the sentence, you know, you create something out of nothing. There's nothing sensible about that statement. And so if you're going to make arguments, you at least ought to be logical when you're talking about those things. And so, but God is omniscient, he's omnipresent, all powerful. This is all, you know, fundamental to Judaism. He is, and of course, they believe in a Messiah, but they don't believe that God, they don't believe in, of course, what we'd say the Holy Ghost. They put here the Holy Spirit. If we're talking about the Holy Spirit as the power of God, well, of course they believe in that. But the Holy Ghost as a personage, no, they do not. And they certainly don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. God is one, he's alone, and so on. And so when you speak of the term Elohim, which is the name of God, or Yahweh, even Jehovah, they are two different names for one and the same God. It'd be what we consider to be God the Father. And there is only God the Father as far as Jews are concerned. The Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. You know, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's a great statement of faith. Great in and of itself, it's a great statement of faith for anyone, I suppose. But it's also something that Jews would speak often before they would die, before they were killed, or whatever. They would state that as a great statement of faith. Yeah.
The Hellenistic influence had not occurred in Israeli things by the time Jesus occurred. They hadn't changed the anthropomorphic God when Jesus was alive.
It came, you know, the Hellenistic influence started with Alexander the Great. So 300 years before Christ.
But were they influenced by that?
Oh, yeah.
At that time?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
The Greeks got to Israel.
Alexander the Great changed the world in that part of the world.
Oh, I know that.
Changed the world in that part of the world because what he brought through was all, you know, all these people followed him. Of course, he didn't last that long.
But why were they asking then Jesus how the Father looked? And he said, well, you want to know, you know, how he looks?
Well, yes, but you're speaking Christianity there, and he's, you know, these are those that had been with him for 3 years.
At the time, Hebrews.
Well, sure, but they had been with Christ for 3 years, so they weren't speaking the normal Hebrew ideas and thoughts. Now that had changed. That had changed a great deal.
Pharisees both.
And of course, but you know, you also look at it from the point of view that if he is the Messiah, they weren't really at that time. Even the Christians were still working with the idea of who is Jesus, what was his relationship to the Father. And so you have this idea when they're talking about, you know, show us to the Father who is God. He was the revelation of the Father. But it would take, you know, I mean, look at it from the point of view that Peter and James, John, all these stuff, they even days before the crucifixion and the resurrection, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what was happening. I mean, they'd been with him all this time. They were entirely confused and you know, with this whole thing. And it would take them some time, certainly that 40 days after his resurrection, for them to really understand the full significance of these things. They had been with this man, not every day, but much of 3 years. And all of this was astounding to them. These were not men that, well, I don't know that anybody knew the scriptures so well that they could say, oh, he's going to go through this, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and so on. It was only afterwards, and that's how human beings usually look at these things. We think of these after the event, when we have time to look back at it and go, oh, right? I mean, we go, oh yeah.
There were probably still some that believed in the anthropomorphic God at that time, because there were so many different views.
Oh well, yeah, there were plenty. You had many different sects, obviously, in Judaism, and a lot of that had to do with that. But anyway, in any case, yeah, that's right. So, God's qualities, of course, goodness, knowledge, power, and this becomes a part of what this mentioned. Human nature is people learn to worship and obey Him, and that is the one thing that Jews, of course, worked, and all of us do. The idea of, you have to. Joseph Smith said it himself. You have to know the characteristics of God. You have to know who God is before you can worship Him. Before you can do. If you don't know who He is, it's impossible to worship something or some being that you don't know His qualities, the things that He is, what He is, and so on. And so they, and of course, Judaism spent a lot of time on either side of the river, so to speak. They fell into sin many times, turned away from God. God essentially cut them off and then would bring them back, and so on. Something that Isaiah, those of you taking our Isaiah class, talks about to a great extent. It was just constant. But they're not, as it mentions, they're not dogmatic in their beliefs, meaning that they have no, about God, their beliefs about God. The idea of a really set dogma is not something that it's kind of alien to their tradition. They recognize that there are variations among Jews. Obviously, in the time of Christ, there were different sects, right? We've mentioned this, those the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, and so on. But the one thing they do believe in that is central to all of them is that there's concept of God. He is a supreme being. He exists. He created all things, and humans are the high point in God's creation. We are the high point, which we would certainly agree with, and so. But it has been, when you get people. I mean, they had the prophets who spoke about this for a long time, especially those who we'll talk about in a minute, were the prophets who wrote. You had many of those, like Samuel and some of these others that didn't write great things, but we know of what they did. But then you have the great prophets that wrote much of their material down, and it is a long process of dealing in their relationship with God. What is their relationship with God? What should it be? And trying to determine how they should react towards. We're still doing the same thing ourselves, are we not? In our personal lives, if nothing else, it takes time. So the prophets. Of course, it starts really with, we think of Abraham and so on. Abraham is the one, as we talked about before, is the one who brought about, or from him comes the nation of Israel, the people, and but it's Moses who's the great prophet and lawgiver. The other prophets really didn't introduce new laws. They were testifiers, they were interpreters of the law. They spoke of the law, but they didn't bring anything new. And it was Moses that brought the great law, and it would be looked at and interpreted and discussed and so on, and still is to this day. I mentioned, I think, that in the library there at B'nai Israel, they have these very large books, and we're in the center of these pages, and these books are like this tall and about this wide, and you open it up, and in the center of each page is just a little bit of the law, okay, normally, and then all around it is discussion on that little bit there. There's discussion by many of the, as we'll talk about, the sages, the scholars that come long after the prophets, and they discuss it and discuss it and discuss it, and sometimes some things will change a little bit, but it is something that's constantly fascinating to them. And so so these prophets were to speak the truth of God, and it's mostly talking about who is God and what is our relationship with him, rather than we tend to look at the prophets as those who prophesied of the future events. Jews don't usually look at it that way. They talk about it's the law. What is our relationship to God? The law tells us how to react towards him, what our relationship should be. We tend to look at him as, what are they telling us about the future, right? There's Daniel, there's Isaiah, there's all of these. When you have hundreds of commandments that you follow, you're very much interested in what is the law and how do you keep it, and how do you deal with this, rather than what happens in the future. They do look forward, of course, as we'll talk about in a minute. They do look forward to the Messiah, who is yet to come, as far as they're concerned. That Messiah will be foreshadowed by a prophet, a great prophet, which we Christians usually look at that. That's already happened, right? You had John the Baptist, and you see that's the interesting thing. You had John the Baptist, who came before Jesus, and so that fits what the Jews have been looking for some time, much longer than they had been 2,000 years ago. But they were that perfectly fits the idea of the Messiah, who first, before the Messiah, comes a great prophet. John wasn't, we don't look at John as being in many ways as great as some of the other prophets, Isaiah or some of these, but it was John, of course, who had the opportunity to tell of the coming of the Messiah, and also had the opportunity to baptize him. And the Lord said that there is none greater than John, right? So he mentioned that in one place. And so, but we don't always look at it that way. You can't go to a book and see, 15, 20, 30 chapters written by John, right? You don't, just not John the Baptist in any case. It wasn't necessary. He was there just to proclaim the coming of the Son of God and proclaim the coming of the Messiah, which is what this prophet is supposed to do. Excuse me, as far as the Jews are concerned, he will come and prophesy of this coming. So the earlier prophets, again, Joshua, Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, are, they're non-literary prophets. We know a lot of their events that happened, but we don't have writings from them. But later ones, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Malachi, yeah, then you have the great writings, and particularly of those, it's most people would say Isaiah is the great one. And I would certainly agree, and I think most people would. Isaiah is magnificent. And as I mentioned, I think when we teach that class on Isaiah, the rabbi and I had a discussion on that, and we avoided Isaiah because he was so difficult. I've translated several chapters of Isaiah in the past, and it's a lot of work. It's hard. And I asked him about it. I said, the time we were talking about, because we avoided that when we were dealing with just translating, speaking it, and I said, is there anybody in the world today who writes or speaks the kind of things that Isaiah did? And he said, now you have a couple of men, poets or whatever in Israel that are beautiful, but he says, not really. No, he says, I know of no one that speaks or writes the way Isaiah spoke. And I said, well, why do you think that is? And he said, well, Isaiah was one who was of the royal family. We don't know the exact connection, but he was of the royal family, so he had the best education you could get in that day and age. But he also said mostly he had the Shekinah, which is the spirit. So they do talk about the spirit. You see, he had called it the Shekinah. He had the spirit, and so he says he had and also added to that. I mean, you bring the Shekinah, he had an innate great talent, that just something that he was born with, and he learned to emphasize and use. And so they said, so yeah, he's just one of a kind. There's no greater, writer than Isaiah was. And it is beautiful poetry, just beautiful, beautiful poetry, and difficult, but it is, and he has, it has a meter to it that flows. So there's a connection, between Hebrew and English. They all have the same ultimate source, which is the Phoenician language, and so on. The Semitic languages all came out of Phoenicia, and so on. Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, and of course these things they come in. So you can see that it rhymes in many places and has that nice meter that we hear so well as Western speakers. That, and so it's great stuff. In any case, and so you have this prophetic tradition, but it lasts about 1,000 years, from 1400 or so through to about 400, when you have Malachi, the last great prophet that speaks to that. After that time, things just dropped off. It was gone. And what you have then is the rise of scribes, sages, rabbis. Start in, of course, the rabbinical tradition will last down to the present day. It is, you see that if you read the book of Ezra, you find that Ezra was one who brought many people back to Jerusalem from Babylon, and he was a great scribe, a great scholar, and he's essentially one leading the people, and there was nobody else. The royal family was gone, of course, and so on. But his biggest thing is trying to cleanse Israel from, many of the men had married women who were not they were not Hebrews, they were not Jews, and so he was getting to leave off their wives if they could, and and then of course after that, what you have then is you usually have rabbis, which means master, and Jesus himself is called rabbi several times in the scriptures, and so because he certainly was, he was recognized as a rabbi, and it tells us a little bit about we have very little information on the Savior previous to the time he begins his ministry. We have some information up to the time he was 12, and then it's just nothing for many years, 18 years or so. But you have to understand the people recognized him as a rabbi, and of course we would believe normally from what things that usually occur in these things is that he had great instruction, not only from men probably, but from angelic and inspiration, angelic help and inspiration, almost certainly. So, but in any case, it's certainly be interesting to know, would it not, the things that occurred during that time. So the more orthodox of the Jewish faith believe that God will again call prophets, that the Messiah is yet to come, and that, of course, they're correct. We look at it as a second coming; they look at it as the first. But they believe there'll be at least one major prophet before he comes, and that because again, that is not only the idea of what should have happened, what we believe happened 2,000 years ago, but even at the end of the world, when the Messiah comes, they believe that there must be another major prophet, again, a forerunner who announces the coming of the Messiah. Who is that? Who knows? Yes.
Do they believe the prophet will be Jewish? Are
Well,
they looking among their own for this prophet?
Well, yeah, they certainly would. They certainly would. And but there will certainly be one who is comes in accordance to the law, in accordance to prophetic decrees and belief. And so, we would look at it and say, well, we have a prophet here, right? We already have one. And of course, we're one of the few that believe that we are not in many cases, obviously, physical Israel, but we are spiritual Israel. And we talk about tribes, descending from certain tribes that have those characteristics that we are imbued with and inherent in us. I remember having quite a discussion one time with I've mentioned this before at times, but with a man who was the husband of a woman I worked with when I worked at the DA's office. And we were having dinner one night with the one woman. He was all over me. He was just not very happy of the fact that members of the church looked at it that they were of Israel, that they were descended from certain tribes. And he says, you're not, you have to be physically born of a woman who is a Jew, and of course, that. I mean, that's the idea. You have to be born. The father doesn't make a whole lot. I mean, it does make a difference, but that's not whether or not you're judged a Jew. It's the mother, and that's because there are witnesses to who your mother is. Hopefully, they're not, because there's witnesses at your birth. Hopefully, there are no witnesses at your conception, and that's the idea. So there's a lot of people around when you're born, right? And so that's where you're a Jew based upon who your mother is. And if your mother is Jewish, you're a Jew. But you also, the rabbi taught me at one time that the whole reason that the story of Ruth is in the Bible is it's because how would you become a Jew if you were outside of Israel? How would you do that? And it's stated right in there. Ruth states it. That you shall be my people, and I will be. You shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. And she goes and she lives. And he says, the rabbi says, yeah, you would have people that come from outside of Israel, but they come into Israel and they marry into Israel. They live in Israel. They obey the God of Israel becomes their God. The people of Israel become their people. And you're Jewish, as time goes on. Because Ruth, of course, was obviously the great grandmother of King David. And so he says that's really why the story is in there, is because that is how somebody who's outside of Israel becomes a Jew. And so there you have it. There it is. It's all interesting things. So going on, the Torah. The Torah is law. It means, essentially it's the foundation of Judaism is the Torah. It's the law, the precept, the statutes. And it's religious law. But what's interesting is that we base, we have the Judeo-Christian ethic, this idea, the tradition. We base our laws. I mean, you read, I know you all don't read Leviticus or, some of these things, some of these law, Deuteronomy, or not Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, some of these, I mean, the law, these things that you have, it's not easy reading. I picked up a book here recently that had the Hebrew English version of Leviticus. It was just a kind of large, oversized book, not very thick because Leviticus isn't very long, but it's rough. It's rough reading, but it is law, and our own system of laws. Of course, we talk about the that which we adopted, the common law, which we adopted from England. But when you read what's called case law in the Old Testament, it's how things are decided, which some of this goes back to the ancient Greek as well, when they determined that, you had to look at circumstances of crimes. The Greeks believed that Apollo gave that to them. You had to learn, you just couldn't, somebody kills somebody else, you just don't go kill them. You have to look at why did he kill? What were the circumstances? And so they do that.
The thing that makes England common law is if something existed time out of mind. If nobody can remember when it was any different, then it's about it.
Yeah, and of course the big thing we love English common law, because one of the main features of that, rather than the Roman law, is that the state must prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Under the Roman law, you had to prove that you were innocent beyond a reasonable doubt.
And also,
We like
it
it.
would crime if they hadn't written a law.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the big thing was, I mean, there's a lot of circumstances like that, but the big thing was that was because, the if you under the Roman law, how are you going to prove your own innocence? Especially if you're dragged to another country or whatever, another place. But anyway, going back, so you have this the Torah, which is the law of Moses, the 5 books of Moses. There is also an oral law that was carried down through many generations, and you see a lot of that. There's hints and ideas of that in the Gospels where you talk about this with the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, these different people, and it is and of course as time went on, they would have the Talmud, which is a law that occurs, or ideas on, mostly commentaries on the law and the scriptures. And that goes on for hundreds of years after the time of the diaspora, dispersion of the Jews throughout much of the world. But in the long run, the Torah refers essentially to the entire body of Jewish teaching, even to the future words of a Jewish scholar. So, they can add to that as time goes on. Some of the great ones, we mentioned Maimonides, Rashi is another one. They have these the great scholars in the past, but they look at it as that could still be added to by a great scholar in the future. And I'm not familiar with anybody in particular that, you hear of great rabbis and so on in the Jewish faith, but so you find it first, of course, in the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and you can go. There's Jewish literature that's accumulated over the centuries, a lot of Jewish literature, and so on. And we understand that. We have in the church, we have the General Conference talks. You have the Journal of Discourses. You have books written by general authorities, church periodicals, even the Latter-day Saint, the hymn book would be considered part of this. The hymn book, of course, we sing these things. We don't often think of these things as being part of what some people call scripture, but it is. It says the hymn books, the hymns were picked particularly because it describes much of what we believe. And so we sing those things, and so it's something that's very important because it describes what we believe, and it's something that we reaffirm as we read these things, as we sing these songs, and so on. It is very, very much the same. It's always amazing to me, and we'll talk more about this, but it's very amazing to me how there's very much a similarity between the two faiths, between ours and Judaism. Justice, of course, we mentioned that justice was one of those 5 great beliefs. The Maimonides particularly emphasizes the idea of justice. Let me see here. This might be a question, but maybe not. No. All right. So the justice is one of the big, this idea that God is, of course, absolutely perfectly just. We in the church, of course, mostly because of the things we read in the Book of Mormon, certainly you find justice throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, but and mercy is something you find when you have the Savior. But the best discourses on this you probably find in the Book of Mormon. Mercy and justice, and will mercy rob justice? So these kind of things. And Judaism, the big one is justice. The mercy is not something that is initially equated completely with justice. We look very much to God's justice. Actually, in our case, we look very much towards mercy. Justice is for somebody else, right? Not for me. What I'm looking forward to is mercy, right? Justice is for somebody else. But the idea is that God's justice, as far as the Jews are concerned, will be promptly delivered. And and of course, every major period of Judaism, they talk about this, and of course, they've had, Jews are certainly the most persecuted race in the history of the world, no question. Other people would say something different, but no, this has been going on with Jews for essentially most of their history, 4,000 years this has been happening, and yet they are still here. I've told you the story about was it Frederick the Great or whatever, this idea of how do we know there is a God? Did I tell you that one? Yeah. And so the Jews are still here, despite every attempt to destroy them, to wipe them off the face of the earth, to exterminate them. I had a friend that is of the Church of God that I talked with here last evening. He was looking for some books to study, and we talked about Israel, and especially the things that are going on now. And I said, in my case, I would be very hesitant to fight Israel, because history would show us, and I'm just talking history, these people should not be around still. They should have been gone a very long time ago. No reason, all the great empires are gone, all of them. But the Jews are still here, and every time one of these great empires would travel through Israel, they try to destroy them, going and coming, and coming back, and they're still here. All through that, they should be long gone, but they're not. They're still here because God promised that, and with Moses. Through Moses, God promised there would always be a man to stand before him. So I would be very hesitant. In fact, I wouldn't even be hesitant. I just wouldn't do it if it was my case, because it's not possible. You can't destroy them. You can't do it. God keeps his promises. And so, and Jews, of course, Jews, as far as justice, you see, people wonder about the justice of God. Jeremiah was one of those. After the book of Jeremiah, you have the what's it called? The 5 or 6 chapters of Lamentations. Thank you, the Lamentations. And if you read that, Jeremiah is very outspoken, very brave. He's upset. He's very upset with God. He's mourning for his people. That's what a prophet does. A prophet, stands between God and his people, and brings them the message that God would have him bring, and he loves the people, and so on. And he says, his main complaint is, yes, the people were evil. Yes, the people had left their covenants. Yes, they'd done all this, but are the Babylonians better than than your people? He's very upset, and so the Jews, of course, are very they talk about this justice and God's justice, and they believe that in order to have it, even in their own society, they need to work for it. They often are involved in social rights, voting privileges, anti-discrimination activities. They're very much involved in that, though you wouldn't think so with everything you hear the last 2 or 3 weeks, right? They want the rights of justice and so on for everybody, not just for themselves. And so you often see that justice is a big thing for them. We would agree, certainly, though we tend to also talk about, on the other hand, with mercy. Yeah.
Do they see their continued existence as evidence of God, or?
No, I don't think there's any question. And they also, the question was, do they see their continued existence as evidence of God? No, I think they do. They know their history better than anybody, and they look at this, and it's especially with, you see, to them the persecutions obviously are very personal, right? Very much, and so they look at all the certainly with the Holocaust and this thing that happened most recently, but they go back and through the Middle Ages, all the pogroms, the Crusades. The Crusades were only supposed to go after after Islam, after the Muslims, but they decided, long as we're going a long way, let's kill the Jews while we're at it, this kind of thing. And this went on, and of course, he looked at all the attempts by the great empires to destroy them, to wipe them out, to wipe them off the face of the earth, and so very personal, obviously, with good reason, and but yet they're still here. And I think that is, and not only are they still here, but they have become a great nation. In many ways. I mean, small country, but a great nation. And so they, there's no question that they look at this and say, without God, this would not have happened. They would not be where they are. And anybody that, like I said, you study the history, you have to agree. It's one of the greatest proofs of the existence of God that I know of. It's just unbelievable that this, you look at, it's just, in fact, this friend of mine was saying, it's impossible. It is absolutely impossible. There's no way they should still exist as a people. He's right. And yet there it is. Because with God, you see, nothing is impossible, right? And so there it is. It's one of the great proofs. They are still the chosen people. And so then the last thing, of course, the fifth one, the Messiah. He is, of course, obviously their belief in the Messiah. He's a special anointed. That's what Mashiach is Messiah, the anointed one. Christos in the Greek. He is one to come to destroy the wicked, and he is the anointed one to do that. He established a messianic reign of peace and prosperity, righteousness, this great kingdom. And however, how this is supposed to happen is something that Jews don't necessarily agree with throughout. More Orthodox Jews, and those most Orthodox in their beliefs, that they need to live a very strict, obedient, religious life, and they believe there will be one contemporary, as we've talked about, one contemporary prophet at least one before the coming of the Messiah. And then also, interestingly enough, at the time this happens, and of course they're reading the same scriptures we are, that the earth will be filled with, just abominable baseness, wickedness, and so on. And the Messiah will come to eradicate that. Well, this friend I was talking to last night, he says, "You think we're there?" And I'm saying, boy, yeah, that's what he was saying. And it seems like we're sliding right down into that mess. And so, but then you have others more liberal. They don't believe really in an actual messianic figure. That they say they kind of feel, as it puts here, that as people become more intelligent and sensitive, society as a whole will gradually elevate itself to a higher plane of ethical practice until war will be no more and the peoples of the earth will take care of each other, that no hunger or oppression. Okay, all of those things won't exist. I don't see any great hope for that. I mean, it sounds great, and certainly we're better than we have been in a long time. But that was the great hope for for a lot of these organizations after World War II and so on. And of course, actually, as far back as between 1885 and say 1900, actually between that and really the time of the First World War, many people thought, many writers wrote the fact that we have finally made it. We have finally turned away from this desire for war and this evil. We're coming into the modern age. We're going to have this wonderful society throughout the world, and all this is going to be better. And we have a ways to go, but we're going there. We've done it. We finally got there. And then you had World War I, of course, and followed soon after by World War II. And you kill 14, 15 million in World War I, and between 80 and 100 million in World War II, and so on. I mean, it's just no. I don't think we're going to get there through this natural progression. Yeah,
there are areas in which people are improving, medicine.
Oh yeah, no, science. Science technology has done very well. Yeah. We are improving for that, but are we improving overall in human nature and some of these things? No. I mean, we've done amazing things. It's really because of who we are. We are the children of God. We can do great things, and when we have long periods of peace, we do great and marvelous and wonderful things. But is the United States better now than it was 30, 40 years ago? 50 years ago? No, it's there's huge divisions in this. There's people who, want to tear it apart. One of the things that's interesting, when this country was formed, we believe founded by God, there were many different faiths that came in to do this. But you had Catholics and Protestants of all sorts, and Jews and different people. But one of the things they did have is the basic they had is a belief in, many of them, of course, if not most of them, are coming here to fleeing religious persecution, but they believed in a basic, the basic underlying themes of justice and mercy and law and the Judeo-Christian ethic and so on. That's no longer true. No longer true in this country, and it turns further and further. They religious belief in different sects goes up and down, but overall we are going over the edge in many ways, and people want to tear down what God has founded, and we actually believe that, of course, that God did found this nation, as we mentioned in our great documents, which. That in itself shows you those documents. We're really the only nation in the world, in the history of the world, that has had a constitution that has lasted as long as this. Many countries have gone through many constitutions over the last 250 years, and the basic reason why is because we're the only ones that have a constitution, Declaration of Independence and so on, that declares that we have rights granted to us by God. Because if you say that they're granted to us by men, well, then men can take them away. Yeah, but if they're granted to us by God, that can't be done. Yeah.
According to the Wall Street Journal, the study has been researched that people are starting to righteous people are starting to search for religion again. Church attendance is finally up a little bit. Of course, the non-believers are way more of that.
Yeah, no, and it's, you have that, and those things happen when things get really rough, which things are. So a lot of people rediscover their faith or whatever. But at this point, with the things that are going on, and many righteous people, so-called, or many what we thought were religious righteous people, are allowing it to happen. Once you start allowing these things to occur and you don't do what's necessary to stop it, it's just going to continue. And I encourage my students, I said, please try to spend at least 15 minutes listening to some news, something other than playing games with that phone you've got. It's hard to get them to do that, but you have a large proportion. Well, just look what's going on at our exalted Ivy League schools and so on. Yeah, look what's going on there. Are they learning anything? No, and they're quite frankly historically illiterate. And illiterate in other ways as well. They've never had a history of Western civ. They know many, and especially it's with young women, early 20s to into the early 30s. Many of them believed that the United States has been just this way, technologically and everything else, for 200 years. They have no idea where we've come in 200 years. Because we never learned.
And racism is terrible now.
Oh yeah, racism. Yeah, racism. So this is where, anyway, that's a nice aside. Tangents are the spice of life, are they not? And so we go on. But anyway, the Messiah. And of course, others. This idea that we're talking about the more liberal group. Mankind, they say that mankind itself will bring about a messianic period. I don't see that happening, but no, we look for a Messiah, and I think the prophets are clear on that. And so and by the way, you asked a question about, do Jews see these things themselves? And it mentions here that they're steeped in the traditions and history of their past. I mean, this is something they celebrate every year through the different. We'll talk about some of these festivals in a minute and so on. He says they believe and they sense that they have a very vital role to help the world to a better future, and of course they would, because God has told them that is something for them to do. It's not unusual. I don't think it's not unusual that when you look at Nobel Prizes, that the vast majority of them were given to Jews. Yeah, to Jews, and it's something that many people don't know. But why? Well, I think you can answer that question yourself, because this is what they do. This is what they think. Yeah.
How long has it been since they've had a prophet?
Well, they haven't had a prophet since Malachi, in the real sense of the word. They're looking forward to one, many of them. Others, no, if you're more liberal, then you don't believe there's really a Messiah coming. But those that are more orthodox, you're looking for a prophet to come yet. And and of course, they believe that they really can, and many of them, elevate society to a higher plane. Certainly, they have in the great things that they've contributed to society. And again, most of them have been Jews that have done that. And
Einstein was a Jew.
What's that?
Einstein.
Oh yeah, Einstein was a Jew. Yeah, they not all of them are practicing Jews, so to speak, but they are, and so one way or the other, they have this either the idea of the Messiah or this messianic spirit. They really have that, and they look at it that way. So you had a question about you have, and then where we want to go from here is talk about some of the Judaism today, some of the festivals, and so on. So you ask about the Ashkenazi or the Sephardi or Sephardic. The Ashkenazi, of course, are from up north in Europe. Most of that, the Sephardic and their Sephardi are from Spain, North Africa, the Balkans, and so on, the Middle East, and that's what there is a difference in sometimes language difference in pronunciation of the language and so on. What I learned was a Sephardic, and the rabbi used to say, anytime he'd go to Israel, of course he's speaking a Hebrew that is ancient. He said it was like Moses coming off the mount. Nobody understood him, what he was talking about. And so in any case, fortunately, most of the world, when you go to travel, they have English, because it is the lingua franca of the modern world. But and of course, the largest communities of Jews are obviously in the United States and in Israel. You have small colonies here and there throughout the world, but 6 million or so in the United States. That hasn't changed a great deal. The numbers given in here are from 40 years ago or so, 35 years ago, but things haven't changed greatly. But I heard just recently that we're talking about 6 million at least in most of them, of course, in the Northeast, a lot of them in New York City and so on. A lot of
In Florida.
well, yeah, you have a lot of there too as well. A lot of in places, but anyway, and so you have in both, Israel and the United States. There's still some in Eastern, not Eastern Europe. I was going to say you have some in Canada, Great Britain, France, of course. Even still, a lot of them still in Russia and places like that. Many of them, of course, continue to move to Israel or to the United States when they have that opportunity, because things are not comfortable in many of these places of the world. So going into from that into the Jewish festivals, I think a lot of us have some idea of what these festivals are. We've heard about them in many cases, and of course the most important ones, they have well, we'll go through each one, but there's five major ones that they will cover. The Passover, the Shavuot, the Rosh Hashanah, the Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. But there's others that you have, and some fun ones, of course. And so the Passover, of course, we know a lot about. A lot of us have taught that. If you've taught seminary or some of these things, sometimes you do a Passover, or you might have been invited by friends, Jewish friends to a Passover or whatever. Obviously it's one of the most important ones, of the idea of the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt, and under Moses, of course, and his work. So this is they look interesting. They look forward to they eat certain things, of course, the bitter herbs and other dishes to remind them of slavery and experiences of their ancestors. But they also set a chair, they open their doors and to greet Elijah, who was as a forerunner of the Messiah, is to come on Passover. So will Elijah come again, or one known as Elijah? That's what and so they eat the bread, drink the wine of the redemption, and God saved the Israelites. That's that's it. And of course, this idea it is a reference to redemption from sin, redemption from slavery, redemption that leads to freedom. It's a great festival celebrating freedom from these things, both spiritual and physical slavery, if you will. And so one of the great ones, that's probably the one we know most about. And that's celebrated in April. 7 weeks later, you have the Feast of Weeks, the Shavuot, the Pentecost, if you will. And originally, it was a harvest festival when most of Judaism, the Jews were involved in harvesting, farming, and these kind of things. These days, a little more, commemoration of giving of the Torah, the fact that God gave the Jews the law, and they have that, and they celebrate that giving of the law because it is the law by which they live, and which makes them who they are, a separate people. And God wanted them to be a separate people, assigned to the world of the special relationship that God wants with all of his children. But this was, and so they do this. They there's the eating of dairy dishes, or they do, and but it talks about this idea of a physical harvest, but spiritual revelation as well. Spiritual revelation that God blesses us with the good things of the world, of the earth, and so on, but also that we can receive revelation at times. And then you have another fall festival, Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, celebration of the New Year. It's kind of the celebration of the birthday of the world, beginning of the new year again. So they count their years. Their time is counted from the time of Abraham, and so if 1990, they have in here. 1990 was the year 5,751. They've been around a long time. I remember being at New Mexico State as an undergraduate, and it was 1976, and walking through the history department looking for a professor, and saw a little note on the door which said that the British were wondering why we were making such a big deal about 200 years. Said they still study that as current events, So we were thinking, well, this is quite something. We've been around 200 years, but anyway, they've been around for 5,751 years and more. Now at this point, more like 5,800 years in any case. So I talk about creation, the blowing of the shofar. This is, the celebration of the new year, the fact that they are, that God is still with them, that they are still here, that they are, and they also, some of the dietary customs, they eating fish, pieces of apple dipped in honey. That sounds good, right? And they dress up, they clean their bodies, they get a haircut, they get new clothes. They're starting anew. This is a new beginning, and they do it every year. And they have a Talmudic, what they call a midrash, a commentary on that year. It says, why before Rosh Hashanah do Jews cut their hair and get new clothes? If someone on trial knows that he faces a merciful judge, he expresses his confidence that he will be able to start anew by presenting a fresh new appearance. On Rosh Hashanah, we are like repentant transgressors, standing confidently before a compassionate, merciful judge. Nice thought, is it not? It's a great thought. Yeah, it's a great thought. So, and then the really serious one, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This is really serious. I had a friend who was Jewish who used to say it's a day of tremendous fasting, confessing of one's sins to God. It is really the most sacred day of the Jewish year, asking each other's forgiveness, day of prayer and communion, with God. He said the synagogue is usually crowded to overflowing. There is, remember my friend was saying, she says people, when they fasted, they really fasted. I mean, they wouldn't take any water whatsoever which means they didn't brush their teeth. They didn't, they stayed away from. She said that it wasn't the most pleasant time, but she said, and this is of course a very young woman talking about it, but very strict fasting occurs, and there's some. Let's see, I think we have a little time to read what this is about, the events, because this is really the most sacred time. It says Yom Kippur is the climax of the extended period of penitence and renewal beginning in the month of Elul, and is observed through strict fasting and self-scrutiny. The liturgy for this most holy day begins a little before sunset of the 10th of Tishri, and after a night pause, continues from early the next morning through the sunset of that day. This great day of awe emphasizes self-examination, repentance, and need for God's centeredness. The liturgy is filled with hope and confidence of divine mercy, but humbly so, and it is replete with extensive confessions and meditations, read silently aloud with the community. Significantly, an old ruling in the Mishnah emphasizes that the prayers and ritual of Yom Kippur only atone for sins between the individual and God, not for sins between one person and another. For this reason, it's customary to seek personal forgiveness or reconciliation from members of one's family and community before beginning of the prayers. That's be hard at times when you think. The Jew thus moves first to strengthen links of interpersonal solidarity, and then to the matter of the personal relationship with God. It should be emphasized that the transition to privacy before God is neither abrupt nor final. Throughout the liturgy, the individual repeatedly recites confession in a collective voice, we and us and so on, and bows down or sings with the community. Nevertheless, Yom Kippur is a time of great interiority and private reflections. Yeah, and so it's and of course you have the final blast of the shofar, and your 100 blasts are blown on Rosh Hashanah, but in this one it's one. It's no longer piercing or wailing call for self-awakening and contrition, but a triumphant blast that follows the communal proclamation that is one fellowship under one God, one people under one God. It's very serious, day, very serious. And so just two other things, we know about Hanukkah. There's also Sukkot, which is the booths, the fall festival that happens in October, and harvest celebration, 8 days, and people will eat and sleep in some of these booths that they produce. I remember maybe it was a couple of our children, they had I don't know if it was a woman who was Jewish herself, but they built one of these booths when they were in grammar school, in the classroom, and learned all about what this was about. And it's very much a joyous celebration, and talking about the bounty that God gives us. In this case, obviously it was at the harvest season, but that can easily be extended to the idea that God gives us bounty through much of our life, right? All that we have has come from God. I mentioned Hanukkah. We all know Hanukkah, the celebration around them, but the one that was fun that I remember somewhat was that Purim. Purim is the kind of the fun one. I remember the rabbi showing me a picture. Everybody dresses up in costumes and so on, and they go into of course, they're in the synagogue, and all the kids to bring all the noisemakers they can get their hands on, and everybody's in this. And he showed me a picture of the rabbi when he was dressed as a Catholic nun, which is really interesting. And they go in there and they read the book of Esther, and they have someone who be able to read this scripture to the whole congregation is considered a great privilege, and you want to read it. You want to really sound good reading this, and it talks about Haman. Eventually gets to Haman, who's trying to destroy the people, and the idea is for quite a while Haman isn't mentioned, but as soon as the kids are right there, just waiting to hear that word Haman, and when they hear it, they just let go. It is raucous. They're making all this noise, screaming, yelling, and of course, then it kind of quiet them down. So he goes read, but of course, pretty soon when you get 3/4 of the way through the book, Haman is mentioned every other line, And this person's trying to read this, Rabbi's describing to me. He's trying to read this with great, plumb and so on. But here comes Haman again, and boy, they let go, and they this is the one time when they can make all the noise they want to make in a place that usually they have to be very quiet. And so they make sure this happens. It is a great celebration of course, of freedom and so on. As it mentions here, it's an especially enjoyable occasion for the children. Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. So you have rituals. You have, of course, the synagogue. Synagogue's very simple house of worship, very much like our chapels. Very simple. No reason for it to be. You notice, you'll go to Utah sometimes, you see some of these older chapels, and they're a lot more decorated and different things than which we have. Huge, paintings is the size of this board here. Very huge, very big, but they tend to be very simple. And you have, and of course that's where you have the opportunity to meet together, to discuss things, to read, bits and portions of the scripture, to we talk about the talks we have and so on. But a very it's considered a very special occasion to not only get together as a people, but to enjoy the presence of the Spirit of God and so on, or with God Himself. So talking about the Sabbath. Sabbath is very serious thing. It goes from Friday evening, the sunset on Friday evening, to the sunset on Saturday evening, 24 hours. And of course, it's a time mostly for the ideas for the family. We get together, the mother, father, the children, and to enjoy the meal on Friday evening. And many, there's obviously time to keep Sabbath and keep the Sabbath. It says the Talmud says that if Israel would keep 2 Sabbaths as they should be kept, the redemption of the Messiah would come at once. I guess it hasn't happened yet. Many Jews don't attend the synagogue. Many don't, and even the majority of Israeli Jews, and I think there's more now than there had been before, but for a long time, many of the Israeli Jews didn't attend the synagogue. But it is it's one of these things where you have the opportunity to, with others, to pray and to worship God in a place that's set aside for just that purpose. And they don't usually have music. Usually you'll have the cantor that will sing, chant or whatever, the law and some of these things. But in the more liberal and sometimes conservative congregations, you might have organ music and so on. I'm when you go into Christianity, the more liberal, Protestant sects, I'd love to have organs, piano, even string instruments, cellos, violins in our services. I tell my friends who are the Protestant, the ones that have essentially the jazz band or the rock and roll. No, it's just not spirit for me. That's it. I can't do that. But anyway, there it is. The mikvah. Of course, the mikvah is essentially what we would call. They call it the ritual bath. We call it, where baptisms occur. And it is mostly used for cleansing. It's been around forever. In fact, a Jewish community archaeologically in that part of the world, particularly in the Middle East, when you have come across a mikveh or two in the area, that Jews were there. The mikveh has to be one that has running water. It can't, it has to come from someplace and then go to someplace else. Once it's in the mikveh, it has to go, so it has to be moving water. Not necessarily all the time, but that's the idea. It can't be stagnant. And it's a biblical practice. It's used, women use it after menstruation and childbirth. Men, of course, will use it for things for cleansing of infectious sores. If you'd ever touch the dead, you'd be unclean in any way, shape, or form. You need to do that. But converts to Judaism, they would also be what we'd call, they're baptized. They're immersed in the mikvah, and so they have what we would consider very much like a baptism. And if they purchase any kind of vessels from Gentiles, they have to clean those in the mikveh as well. Okay, cleanse them, and before they use it for food preparation. What's that?
Is the mikveh a specific place? Or?
Well, yeah, they would have. I mean, they would. It would be a. I mean, some very wealthy families anciently would have their own separate mikveh, but mostly you had one that two or three in the community, and the and those would be constantly used. I mean, they would have water that, again, a place that was higher that would allow the water to flow into the mikveh. And then after, people had used it, then of course it would flow out. And then they would be refilled from this other place. It can't be stagnant water. And obviously, I mean, that makes perfect sense. But yeah, so mostly they had them in communities. So the community would have several. It depends on the size of the community. But you would have these mikvahs. And you could.
Is this current?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's current. Very much so. It's current. And so again, the much more liberal might not, have that, but the certainly conservative and Orthodox, you have I remember the rabbi just talking about it, that because I asked him about the idea of a baptism, or do they do that with that? He said, "Oh yeah, we he kind of smiled and said, yeah, we baptize." And he is such a good man, just such a good man. Anyway, of course, circumcision, we know all about circumcision.
8 days old.
What's that? 8 days old. It's the rights of the covenant. It represents the covenant with Abraham, the original covenant. And so I guess this is kind of this may be I don't think it'll get me in trouble, but I would just, it reminds me of, we were showing pictures of to my students. These are ninth graders. And we're looking at Greek vases, or vases as they call them. There was a whole film of these vases, and they had these Greek soldiers fighting. And the boys, of course, the boys are, they're so much more immature than the girls are, obviously, and of course, all these figures on there are naked and nude, I guess I should say, but the soldiers are all nude. And of course, none of them have been circumcised because the Greeks didn't circumcise. And so the boys are just giggling. They thought that was the weirdest thing they'd ever seen on these men. And they thought that they were deformed or something because, I'm sure we can say their penises just didn't look right, and they're there giggling and, in each other and laughing. And it's just like, I want to try to explain to them, okay, there's no circumcision here. That is something that is, a sign of the covenant. Though there were many people later that would circumcise, but circumcision is to the Jews is something that is a sign of the covenant with God. And you find that very early in Genesis. And so, and of course, they have the bar and bat mitzvahs. The bat mitzvahs for girls, those who come of age. And of course, until a boy or a girl has that, until they have that bat mitzvah, and it's, son or daughter of the commandment, mitzvah is a commandment. And of course, they would prepare themselves for this by studying the classics of Judaism and be prepared for that. So, bat mitzvah was something that's more modern in many ways, but the bar mitzvah has been around for a long time. The mezuzah on the that were placed, it comes from, the mezuzah is this, it has a little receptacle, which inside of that you place it on the front door. You can also place it a lot of times in rooms within the house. The idea is as you go in and come out, you remember who you are and who God says that you are. And it's the verse from Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Essentially is, the Shema Yisrael, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And so you see it also in Deuteronomy 6 and 11. And so you have that there, and you'll see Jews that will, touch their lips and then touch that. The idea is to remember who you are as you go out of the house, as you deal with other people, and who you are as you, when you're within the house. It just reminds you that you are the children of God, as the Lord told the Pharisees in in chapter 10 of John, you're the children of God and you should act accordingly. You act as God would have you act. It's a great thing. I had some students who bring me a bunch of them from different places and had them throughout the house. And anyway, we need to finish up here. So we have 5 minutes. So, dietary laws, I'm not going to spend much time with that. Mitzvot, of course, is the commandments, the religious obligation of duty, doing those kind of things. Now, what I wanted to spend just the last few minutes on is that there's a lot of, because we have the Book of Mormon, we have a lot of insight into Judaism. It's filled with that, no question, and which is quite interesting from a man who, if he was making it up, he certainly knew a lot about Judaism. He once asked his wife. He said, "What?" He was reading the Book of Mormon, reading that as he's doing this translation. He said, "What? Jerusalem had walls around it?" He had no idea. As she mentions that much later. But so we have these kind of things, and so the similarities, which are always interesting. Both Jews and Latter-day Saints believe they have a special mission here on the earth to prepare others for a messianic period. Both communities, religion is ideally much more than an occasional visit to a place of worship. It's a part of your life. This is something that should be innate within us. It's part of our life. Has even, affects the food, the drink habits, these things. Both Jews and Latter-day Saints advocate political rights and religious freedom for all people. And of course, in many cases, certainly Jews and Latter-day Saints Jews certainly have been victims of discrimination, but so have Mormons, as we once upon a time called ourselves. These two religious communities each worship in buildings that are free of expensive ornamentation. Service are not always the most prompt or quiet. Well, that's for sure. But there are occasions of friendly assembly and so on. Many religious expect the mother to provide the primary religious education of the children. The family, Latter-day Saints and Jews both believe the religious upbringing is a patriarchal responsibility. The father doesn't need to do the teaching, but he needs to ensure that the children are properly taught. We look at it's a little change these days. We look at as really it's a primary responsibility of both parents should do that. But the family is the primary focal point, both religious communities. Jews and Latter-day Saints, along with Catholics, tend to have more children than everybody else in the world. Religious education for Jewish boys begins at age 3 and continues until their bar mitzvah. And of course, you have the bat mitzvah. Latter-day Saints, we start with primary. It's amazing how primary children that go through primary, when they get around to having to get before a group or a crowd or something, they rarely have any fear of speaking before a large crowd because they've been doing it for a long time, doing it for essentially as far as back as they can remember. Both Jews and Latter-day Saints have dietary laws, separate them from most of their contemporaries, makes them a peculiar people, right? Yes, okay. Both religious groups have a strong tradition and reputation for helping their own members who have financial, health, emotional, and other problems. That's very true. I tend to listen to Ben Shapiro. He talks about, he's a very conservative Jew, and he talks, maybe, I don't think he's Orthodox, but he's certainly very conservative. He might be Orthodox, but anyway, I'm sure he's mentioned it. But he talk about, the things that they do when somebody has this great problem, everybody gets together and helps them. Ours is probably a little more regularized, but it's very much the same for both. Jews and Latter-day Saints believe that they should do more than declare their beliefs. They should live and demonstrate them by serving others. They recognize that God will judge people according to the individual thoughts and actions as well as beliefs. Both communities have experienced persecution, but the greater contemporary challenge for each is how to maintain the allegiance and involvement of their members, especially their youth, in the face of strong secular materialist and immoral pressures. And last but not least, finally, while Judaism will still anticipates a time when prophets will be on the earth, Latter-day Saints already have prophets who teach and direct them. The need for inspired prophetic leadership is recognized as both groups hope that Jerusalem will become the social model for a new age of freedom, justice, and peace. The similarities are pretty amazing all the time. And that should be understandable because we believe we have the same source. Whether it's physical or spiritual, it's very much the same.
What happened with the temple rights?
Well, you know, it was, and I remember having that conversation about the idea. As far as the temple and that thing, I remember talking to a woman who worked in the DA's office. She was Jewish, and the DA happened to be Jewish, and she said, you know, we talked about the temple. I was talking about we have this temple and so on, that we believe that would be restored. And she says, why? Nobody's going to be sacrificing animals there. You see, so they looked at his point of view. I mean, we look at it as that there's no longer necessary to do that because the great and last sacrifice has already happened, right? But they look at it as that, you know, nobody believes in animal sacrifice anymore. That's not going to happen. So, but yet there is this movement to restore the temple among some of the Jewish factions, and that's been prepared and looked at for some time. But they still look at it from the point of view that sacrifice would occur or continue. We of course look at the temples in very different sorts, but I mean it's different, but it's somewhat the same, is it not?
But it seemed like that was, I mean, certainly at the time, a big part of the law.
Oh yeah, no, it certainly was.
So I just,
But it was always the looking forward to the great and last sacrifice of the Savior, and that sacrifice has happened, and we go on from there. There's still the idea of temple worship because the Lord's people have always been temple worshipers, right?
yeah,
And
I just wondered if they continued some kind of sacrifice.
oh well, there's ones that look forward to that will happen one day, but they have to build the temple. And there are Jews that believe that will come to pass. They're preparing all the instruments, all the things that anciently they used before. They have that, but they just, you know, you have to build a temple. You can't build it on the Temple Mount. But they say some believe that the temple was actually just off this was it south end, east, yeah,
So
south end of the temple.
The temple does not exist in Jerusalem.
No. It was underneath the Alaska Mosque. You've heard a lot about the Alaska Mosque recently. Yeah. Yeah.
So is the the Wailing Wall, is that one wall?
That's one. That's the western wall of what used to be the big temple complex. Yeah, and then one of the great entrances, and of course the buildings that David had and so on were to the south of the temple lots, and but others believe that also just south of that was where the actual temple was. Most people believe no, it was right under where the Alaska Mosque is.
So building a temple is not doesn't seem to have been a priority
For the Jews.
Yeah.
Not for most of the Jews, no, but some, yes. Yeah, some, yes. Okay. Boy, that's a tough one. Get all that through. All right. Thank you all. We will deal with Christianity. Start dealing with Christianity next week. It's a fascinating study. Lots of maybe you don't know about. So we will do that. Would somebody let me close this out?